Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Andrei. I'm from Romania. I work at Microsoft on the Surface Duo team, more specifically the developer experience team. So, I hope that long employer and team and sub-team title already gives you an idea why I'm here. Um, um, So the name of the presentation is Will It Bend? And spoiler alert, this is a Surface Duo and it does bend. So the answer is you already know the answer, but stick around for the foldable support, which I hope is far more interesting than the the funny title, let's say. So I'm here to make sure that your um, application, your Flutter apps can very easily adapt to these new form factors. We will go through um, a, a few parts of this presentation, which are first discussing the technical details of how these new form factors are different. So how foldables are different from candy bar phones, which is the name for the phones you probably have in your pocket. Um, then we will go through a discussion about what it means for an app to be responsive and what it means for an app to be adaptive. And before we even start the presentation, I would like you to think about the two terms because I'll ask you a question in a minute. I'm also going to go through the technical details that are changing in Flutter. So things that are being added to media query and new widgets that you can use. Um, and also explain how apps behave by default. So how your app behaves on foldable devices in this moment. So before we start, I would like to invite you to use the YouTube chat as much as possible. I have it open on my screen, and I want to react to comments and questions if they're not long. If you're going to write half a screen of text, I'm not going to read it, but I would like this to be a conversation. Um, I remember uh, 2 years ago when we were doing in-person conferences. The whole point of a conference was that you would be closer to the speaker physically, and you could actually ask questions during the presentation if the speaker allows it, let's say, and network with people and actually understand in a more meaningful way what is discussed on stage. So hi, Paul. I can see from your name you're also Romanian, so that's all. Um, Maybe say where we're from, just to get to be friendly with each other. And to test this YouTube chat situation, I would like, if you want to participate, I would like you to write in the chat how many years of experience you have with Flutter. If you just started out, you can write 0. That's okay. Everyone at this conference is here for you, basically, in a lot of situations. But if it's 10 years of Flutter, also write that down. I don't know how it's possible, but recruiters always ask that of you. That's like a small zinger for the industry we're in. So there we go. Dino is it has 3 years of experience. Good for you, Dino. Uh, so yeah, thank you guys for participating. I really want this to be a conversation rather than just me sitting here giving you a monologue. So with this communication channel well established now, let's move on to the actual content, the presentation. So you may have noticed that something changed. Devices now can't uh, um, can't cannot bend. Let's say like, they can't stay straight. They started to bend. A few years ago, there was a scandal with devices that bend that they shouldn't bend, but now they do it on purpose. So I'm going to show you the Surface Duo again. The second version with the camera bump. We will also be discussing the foldable support on Samsung devices or really any kind of foldable device. This is not a presentation that is exclusive or very specific to the Duo, although I will be discussing some things that are specific to the Duo just because the Duo does some things very differently from other foldable devices, and I want to touch on those things specifically. So the question is, what really has changed in a from a technical perspective for us developers? Um, it's the addition of these new components of the screen. So in the first image, you have a Surface Duo. It clearly has visible hinges. You can see them. It also clearly has area between the screens, which you can also see. It's a hardware um, yeah, it's a hardware specific thing for this device. But also the foldable devices without a visible hinge still have a hinge, you just don't see it. And not only that, but in the last image, you can see also I highlighted the um, camera bump or camera notch or whatever you want to call it. It's that is also a display feature, if you will, because it always eats from your display. It's present on your display. There are technologies right now that allow for displays to no longer have a hole punch, but the display does have that feature in it. So this is why all these uh, parts, let's say all these new features, they are called display features, and they are of three types at this moment. So you can have a hinge display feature, a fold display feature, and there's also a cutout display feature. Um, a display can have multiple display features if you think about it, because a device can have a fold capability, but it can also have a cutout once you open it. One other technical or one other technical way of describing these new capabilities is also the shape that the device makes. So this would be a flat shape, let's say, and this would be a half opened shape. A bit of behind the scenes, let's say, but there used to be more um, there used to be more shapes. Like we experimented with a tent shape. It wasn't called tent, but kind of looks like a tent, so it makes sense to call it that. And then there's also a completely folded shape. The reason why we stuck as an industry, I guess, with only these two is is because the completely folded shape, for example, doesn't really make sense. You need to grab the display somehow. So one part of the display, so the one of the displays will always be completely disabled for for preventing accidental touches. So right now there's only flat and half opened, but you shouldn't consider this list complete. At some point we will maybe get back to the tent one, or maybe the folded one will make sense at some point. Is there a forearm shape? No, no, there isn't a forearm shape. Um, okay, so let's now discuss, before we dive into the actual nitty gritty and code parts of this presentation, let's discuss the bigger context of adaptive and responsive design. And I asked you to think about what these two terms mean at the very beginning of the presentation. If you don't mind, I would like you to write in the chat what adaptive design means to you. Responsive is a bit clearer for everyone, I think, but I'm curious what you understand through adaptive design without Googling it, because it's you'll find it on Google or Bing. But I'm curious if someone can give me an answer of what adaptive design is. I'll wait for 5 seconds or so, just not to make this too boring for everyone else. But like the shortest version of what an adaptive design is. Okay, I'll take that as a maybe, I don't know. It can adapt to different device sizes and forms. So adapting to different device sizes, that would be maybe responsive design, like desktop, smartphone, and tablets. Thank you for the follow-up. So, Lol, does it run on web or desktop? So yeah, if it runs on web or desktop, you already have an adaptive design problem you need to solve, let's say. So the simple definition for the difference between responsive and adaptive design is that responsive design, when you're talking about responsive design, you're talking about the ability of your application to fill out the entire space it is given. So if you have a very large screen, then maybe you show more, and you have a grid layout, you show more content on the grid. If you have a smaller screen space, then maybe some panels of your app disappear, start to hide, and they are somehow reachable in other ways. So that's responsive design. I don't need to define responsive design too much because it's a term that's very much used in the web world. And it usually refers to, I have multiple sizes at which my website functions perfectly or normally. And it's a thought out process. It's not a coincidence that it still works when it's small. It's something that you design for, let's say. Adaptive design, on the other hand, is when you have the exact same app on Android and on iOS, for example, and the users expect a certain experience on each platform. And maybe that's a bit too loose of an example, but an even clearer example would be you have the same app on your phone because Flutter allows for you to compile your app on mostly anything that has a screen. So you have it on your phone, but it's the same app that you have on your desktop. And I have an image here, which is the default Flutter project. And this is clearly a mobile app that runs on what looks like a Mac OS operating system. And this no longer looks appropriate. You would never have a floating action button on a desktop app. Doesn't really make sense. The floating action button is always in the bottom right, let's say, because it's easier to reach on a mobile device. But on a desktop, you usually have a menu at the top, for example, or some kind of navigation at the top. This has none of that. So this is clearly a mobile application that runs on a desktop. It's not adapted. It's only responsive because if you resize it, it might do some things, but it's not adaptive. So in this context of adaptive design, making your application foldable, work on foldable, is more of an adaptive effort on your side. It's also a responsive one because you have way more screen on foldable devices, so it's almost like tablet real estate. But we'll see in a minute what adaptations you might need to make in your applications. Okay, so Chuckles said that I see what you're talking about. Thank you, Chuckles, for the hint to move on from the subject. So I already discussed what is a responsive, what is adaptive. So earlier I showed you what display features look like in real life. Now I will show you how they look in code. So there will be, everything I'm showing you today is kind of preview. You will have a link at the end that points to documentation on how to use these features right now. But at this very moment, they are still making their way through the Flutter release pipeline. So a few of the PRs are merged, a few of them are still to be merged. But everything I'm presenting to you today, I'm presenting it as if everything is merged, so you can have the full picture of what will be available when everything is released into the master branch. Okay, so the media query will get a new parameter, which is called display features. It's plural because a device can have multiple display features, as I exemplified earlier. And each display features has each display feature has three properties: bounds, type, and state. The bounds refers to the rectangle on the screen, so it defines a geometrical area. It defines the geometrical spacing. So the rectangle on the screen where the display feature is located. This is probably the most important property of a display feature because you will need to take the location of that display feature into account. And don't worry, there are tools to easily do this, and I'll show them to you in this presentation. The type refers to the three types that I showed you earlier: the hinge, the fold, and the cutout. And the posture refers to the shape that the device makes. So it can either be flat or half opened. And this is useful sometimes. I'll show you exactly a really good example of a good usage of this, because the whole purpose of using these is to make the experience as magical as possible for your users. And I want you to leave this whole conference inspired. So I want you to be inspired to do awesome stuff with your application. So I'm going to give you a few good examples for that. In order to fully understand how to adapt your app, we first need to take a step back from code and look at applications more as product owners. So everyone watching this right now is a product owner. You're no longer a developer. Congratulations, I guess, if you think that's a promotion. If you don't think it's a promotion, I'm sorry for you. You've been demoted to product owner. I'm trying to keep it light. So I see a question in the chat, and I'll answer them as I go. I don't want them to pile up necessarily at the end. So can we test this in the dev channel right now? We can test this in a separate Flutter repo, but not the dev channel at this moment. So I'll let you know when that when that's actually possible. So I'll move on now. So how does your app behave in this moment? So I have the device here. Let's see if I can quickly boot it without wasting your time. So for example, if I open any app, I'll just open Notes. It just opens on one screen. It doesn't open on both screens. Even if actually the Notes app, it's the one from Microsoft. It's the Office Notes, or yeah, notebook. So even though this application does support spanning across both screens, all applications at this moment open on just one screen. This means that your application will function exactly as you expect it to behave. right now. So however it works on a Candy Bar phone, it will continue working like that on the Surface Duo. Users can also use two applications side by side, which actually opens applications to certain expectations. So you might expect to be able to drag and drop, for example, an image from one application to another. And Android actually has drag and drop support. Also, iOS has drag and drop support, but the drag and drop support on Flutter is limited inside the app. It doesn't function with the outside world, let's say. And that's the next thing we want to help out. So that's on our 2022 um, plan of things to contribute to Flutter right after we are done with this display feature support. So you can use two apps side by side. You can also span the app. And this is where this whole presentation comes in. When a user spans the app, your application occupies the whole area represented by the two screens, including the hinge. So you don't see two screens, you see one large screen. You also get to know where the display feature is located. So the blue area is a parameter from the display features array inside media query. So in effect, you have everything you need to build an experience for foldable devices. And by the way, this is true also for the Samsung devices as well and other foldables out there. So you will still get an area marked in the middle of the screen. It's just that the type of display feature won't be hinge. The type of display feature will be fold. So you will know what to do according to the type of the display feature. So I promised a few examples. Um, One of them is Outlook. It's a really neat example because it's a productivity app. And the more screen real estate you can have with this app, the more productive you get. So in this case, you have on one screen the list of emails, and on the other screen you have an open email. And Outlook has a few other things that it does. For example, if you go to the calendar inside of um, Microsoft Office, which is kind of part of Outlook, you get to see your calendar spanned across both screens, and you can see more of your week, and everything is not crammed together, but it actually has a lot of screen real estate to show up. Um, Another really nice example is Atlassian Jira. They have a very nice foldable support where you can see your Kanban board or your sprint board, and you can drag and drop items across the screen. And yeah, it works as you expect. It's just that you have more screen real estate to work on your board. And the third really nice example, I love this example, is the combination between the combination between the type of display feature and the posture. So in this render, you can see a Samsung device or like a normal, not normal, but a flip foldable experience. Now, normally the screen isn't interrupted by a hinge area, but the developers still chose to make the experience magical in some way. And whenever you make the device um, go into a half-opened posture, the top screen becomes full screen, let's say, and the bottom screen is left available for comments and browsing and stuff like that. Um, so the question now is, how can you enhance your app? What are the things that you can do? Um, So what will you be doing with the extra screen? And Enos, I see you asked a question or wrote a comment. It's a bit too long. We'll leave it at the end because I saw there's a Q&A session at the end, and I think that's a perfect space for me to read the whole thing. It's a bit long for me to read on the fly. So let's get back to enhancing your Flutter app. Um, First of all, dialogues just work. This was very important to us. We don't want dialogues to break. Most dialogues sit in the middle of the screen, and the middle of the screen is occupied by the hinge on the surface too. So without you doing anything, dialogues just um, yeah, but dialogues just go to the left screen on a left to right setup, and they go on the right screen on the right to left setup. So if the user uses his phone in Arabic and your application actually doesn't override that somehow, um, then the dialog will show up on the right. If you want to have a full control over where dialogues show up, you have a new parameter called anchor point, and that's a offset. So you can view it as a set of coordinates. So if you target the anything on the left screen, it will show up on the left screen. If you target anything on the right screen, it will show up on the right screen. And there's a few reasons why we did it like this. But you can think of this one scenario as being very representative as to why this is powerful. If you press a button, for example, in this example that I have on the screen, you have a show dialog button. So the show dialog button is on the left screen. This for demo purposes, I made the dialog go on the right screen. But normally you would want the experience or the flow that the user goes through, you would want that experience to remain on the same screen. So if you have a dialog on the left screen, you just set the anchor point as the position of that button, and the dialog will show up wherever the button was pressed, if that makes sense. It's a bit more work on your behalf, but you're able to do that easily with the anchor point. It doesn't mean you need to do it. As I said, you don't even need to include the anchor point. If you just want dialogues to work, um, you just need to use this version of Flutter that isn't out yet, but it will just work out of the box. Um, okay, next thing that just works is our pop-ups, and the most common form of pop-ups that developers use are the contextual menus. So it's a bit harder to see what's behind the contextual menu, but imagine it's a list item and it has three dots at the end. And when you press that, you get to do something with the item from the list. So you either delete the item or something like that. Um, so normally the context menu would have shown um, in this area, that's where the green rectangle is. That's where the context menu would have shown, but we've added code to the framework that makes sure that the context menus stay clear of any display feature, and that's true also for cutouts and any other kind of display feature. Um, so this from here on out, I'm also going to discuss other higher level, let's say, design concepts and design patterns. Um, I was thinking if I should take a break just to give you a chance to ask questions about what happened, what I presented so far, but I'm just gonna power through and I'll answer questions in 20 minutes, basically, is the allotted time that I still have. So from our own research, from talking to third-party developers and talking to users and our own experiments, we have reached the conclusion, let's say, that for now, if you have these 5 design patterns in mind as software makers, you will be able to cover most of the design needs or most of the use cases that arise on a Surface Duo or any foldable. So I'll just go through them one by one. What I want to say is that if there ever is a sixth design pattern that makes sense on these devices, we will add it to our documentation. I will add it to my slides. If you see a sixth design pattern, please let me know. We've really worked hard on this. I don't think there's any meaningful sixth design pattern, anything that's not custom to your app, which of course you can go ahead and just do. I just want to first say that all these design patterns, everything that you need to develop for the Surface Duo is also available in Figma format. And you can give this to your product designer, your owner, anyone that is part of the thought process that goes into your app before development. This is super useful for those people. So we're doing our best to offer as much support for you as possible, and this is one way of doing it. So you'll have a download link at the end. It's a pretty awesome Figma um, let's say design kit. Yeah, it is a design kit. So it's a pretty awesome Figma design kit, and you can even like use drag and drop to completely design an app with it. It has a lot of ready to use components inside of it. So the first design pattern is the easiest to understand. It's called extended canvas. You can look at this as the simplest map experience. So because a user can drag the map around, so they can go, let's say they want to see something that's behind the hinge, they can just move the map around a bit. Because of this simple thing that the user can move the content around, extended canvas is a great way of actually not doing anything but obtaining the best experience. So if you have an application that just has a map on one of their one of its screens, extended canvas just means your application already works, because you actually ignore the any kind of display feature altogether. The only thing you do need to take into account is that if the user picks a location on the map and you have a bottom sheet usually that shows up, you should show that on only one screen, not both at the same time. It will be too wide and you'll have text that sits across the hinge. Good news is that this bottom sheets are also dialogues. So they show up on one screen by default. So you don't need to do anything when this is out, but maybe you want to show the pop-up in the same location that the user selected the pin. So if I select it on the right screen, the pop-up shows on the right screen. That's why the anchor point is such a great way of saying, of telling the framework, I want the pop-up to show up here or here, because it ties in very well with a lot of use cases. The second one, and I've already showcased this to you in the Outlook example, is the list detail. This is one of the easiest to pick up for most applications. Most applications have some kind of list. When you open an item from the list, it opens a separate screen with details on the list. If it's a shopping experience, you'll have a shopping list. You open the item, it's a shopping item. You add it to the cart is again another screen. So I think it's also the easiest to understand. If you select an item on the list screen, the details screen shows the item that was selected. What is not very visible in this particular example is that if you open the application for the first time, there will be nothing selected. So that's an opportunity for you to show some kind of pointers on the detail screen, some kind of graphical design or something to indicate what the user can do on that screen, or just use the real estate however it makes sense in your application. If this is a camera app, you can have the camera on the other screen. That's a different design pattern. I'll get into it in a moment. But what I want to say is that this is also a good opportunity to have those tips and tricks that every application at some point wants to implement, but is not sure how is appropriate. On the Surface Duo device, there are plenty of opportunities because of the extra screen. So I've rambled a bit, but the list detail is very straightforward. I don't need to make it more complicated. The two page is everything is in the name. It presents 2 pages of something. It's perfect for a book experience. This is a book about the Roman Colosseum. I'm sure you're very curious to read it. It's all very lorem ipsum-y. But yeah, it's a really good experience for a reading experience. And this is something that you can already see on the Surface Duo if you use the Amazon Kindle app. It already works like this, and it's actually a pretty good. I mean, I've used it to read something already. I've used the Surface Duo, and it's a very nice experience because it's almost the size of a notebook, and it's yeah, it's a really nice experience to offer to your users if you have a reader of some kind. Dual view, this is a bit more complicated to explain, but if you look at the example, I think you'll get the idea quickly. So in dual view, you see the same thing, but in different perspectives. So what I have in this example is a list of restaurants, but also a map of restaurants. And you can have this experience, for example, on Airbnb or any kind of booking site. You usually have the results on one side and the map on a different part of the screen, or maybe it's like a tab. But usually all booking experiences for a location show also a list and also a map. And on the Surface Duo, you can show them at the same time. Now it gets a bit more complicated if you actually want to make this experience really stand out and unique. What I would do, for example, is have an infinite list of restaurants, because you don't want to have this paginated in the classical way of having page numbers at the bottom of the screen. But you can't show the map is not paginated. So there's ways of dealing with this. So if you're showing all the restaurants on the map side, you can show the more highly rated ones if you're zoomed out, and then when you zoom in, you can see like lower rating restaurants or stuff like that. But that's really a problem for map experiences in general. It's not specific to the Surface Duo. I'm just riffing ideas here with you. As I said, I want you to leave this conference inspired to do more, basically. So yeah, another good example of a dual view would be a 3D editing software. I don't know how many people have used, let's say Maya or 3ds Max or any kind of Unity, for example, you can also consider that a 3D editing tool. But usually you have multiple views at the same time. One of the views is usually a 3D view where you can see the fully rendered frame, let's say. But you also have smaller screens with a top-down view or left or front view of the model. And that's because it's very hard in a 2D screen. This is a 2D experience. It's very hard to simulate a 3D object, in the sense that if I have my hand like this and you want to select in that editing software, you want to select one of the fingers, you'll just click here. But which finger am I selecting? There's a lot of them in the Z axis. So that's not a very good or easy experience to simulate on a 2D screen. So what these 3D softwares do is is they have one view, you view the hand like this, but from another view, you view the hand like from here. So this is a very good example as well. So you can have, let's say on the right screen, you can have the 3D render of your object. And on the left screen, you can even split that in half again to have a top-down and a front to back view. I know that seems like a lot if you haven't used 3D software before, but that's actually super typical of these software, like 3D software editing. Okay, I think the last one. Yep, the last one is the companion pane. This one is also very easy to understand. You'll have a image on one screen and the editing tools on the other. If you unspan this experience, you might expect the image to be at the top and the editing to be at the bottom or something like that. But any kind of editing software, like even if it's, I don't know, if it's Photoshop or any kind of Lightroom experience or any kind of photo editing can take advantage of this. And it's not only photo editing. You can imagine anything that has properties that are not visible on the actual object that you're editing. You can imagine them as being visible on the right side. So I think I've spent a bit more time than I should have on the design patterns. I'll just quickly go through the widget that enables them all. Everything that I've shown you thus far is possible to build with the Pane widget. It will be a new widget, part of the framework, hopefully. And what it does is it displays two panes if there's room for them, or if you're on a dual screen device or foldable device. And there's a few ways you can configure it to do what you want it to do. This example that you have on the screen right now is rendered using the same code base. And the code base is this. So two pane, please display two panes, pane 1 and pane 2, which is confusingly named widget A and widget B in my example, but you get the point. And you can tell it a pane priority. And the pane priority can be either both. If it's both, it means that both panes are displayed. If pane 1 is the pane priority, then only pane 1 is displayed. And you can use any kind of logic you want. Of course, maybe you don't inline it as I did, because that's really not recommended, I would say, if you want to have your code as clean as possible. But you're responsible of your own logic. We will give you more examples to see how to deal with this, but this is mostly the gist of it. Here it is with this detail. Again, it's almost the same thing as the previous example, because this A-B example is a very good list detail example. So the A pane is a list and the B pane is the detail. If you're on only one screen, you will see only pane 1. Again, with the companion pane, you have an image and filter controls. If you're only on one screen, you will see only the image, let's say. But I also wanted to show you that the Pane widget also helps you with landscape experiences. So yeah. So I'm on time actually. So a few ideas to take home. Think of these design patterns, or if your team is considering thinking about developing also for foldables. So you're still in the design process with a few of the screens in your app. You can bring this to the table if it makes sense for your users. If your application is a productivity app, you should most definitely look into this, because your users might actually appreciate it a lot. I would also like to invite you to use the emulator that we have for you. The difference between the Surface Duo emulator and the emulator that you can find in Android Studio right now is that the Surface Duo emulator actually also simulates a hinge area. I don't know if you can see, it's not super clear, but in the image behind the background image, let's say, there's a black area in the middle of the emulator, and that's being simulated by the emulator itself. So um, the emulator that you find in Android Studio um, is a foldable experience. There's a fold out emulator, and there's a fold in emulator, which I think is this. It simulates the flip experience. Um, yeah. So to recap, um, you have a QR code that leads you to our documentation, which also contains the emulator, also contains the dual screen design kit, so the Surface Duo design kit. And everything that I've discussed now is also present there. And also you have good documentation on how to use these features right now. Um, I will actually update those that documentation next week because the integration with these features has gotten a lot easier recently. You will only need to run a git command starting next week, and I want to update the documentation to reflect that. If you also want to stay in touch with us and maybe find out, be the first one to find out when our documentation is updated, please follow us on Twitter. Behind that small handle, Surface Duo Dev, there's very, uh, a very, let's say, ambitious team of mixed professions that are all ready to help you. So we have expertise on Flutter, which is, well, I'm participating in that, but we also offer you support for Surface, for React Native, for Xamarin, for Kotlin, Java. I mean, Kotlin. We would prefer if you used Kotlin, but if you just use Java in your project, we will help you out as well. There's documentation at that link for all these platforms and more. We also have Ionic support. There's, I think, I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I think we do. So everything is there. Anything foldable related, you can just go to that link and you'll find anything that you want. Anything that you don't find there, you can ask us on Twitter and someone will respond. I think that's it. Yeah, I had some extra slides for possible questions. We still have a few minutes for Q&A. So maybe I'll go back to Enos, since I promised um, that I'll go back to your questions. By the way, you can still write questions in the YouTube chat, and I'll get to them. So media query has performance criteria of constantly building up, even if a keyboard is popped when typing on a text field. It's possible to have display features elsewhere. So Enos, I have some good news and maybe some bad news according to your question. So the good news is that we thought about this. So it's not something that we didn't consider. It's something that we actually considered very much. That's why, for example, um, whenever you move the device, you close it just slightly. There is a property that this hinge gives you, which is the hinge angle. And the hinge angle, because it's an angle, it can be updated a lot of times during your application runtime. That's why the hinge angle is not part of display feature support and media query. So the reason is exactly what you asked. If we were to make media query update every time the hinge angle changed, your application would start to stutter and it would have all kinds of performance issues because media query is not really good for doing this kind of granular updates. We have a separate library just for the Hinge Angle if you want to do something with Hinge Angle. The reason why it's isolated is, one, the media query support is not such a good place to put an angle in there, but also we weren't able to find that many design patterns that served or that needed to use the hinge angle. You can use the posture, which actually itself uses the hinge angle, but the posture can be half opened and flat. It won't update millions of times during the usage of the display. So what I'm trying to say is, we hear you. I hear your concern. It's been addressed. You don't need to worry about it. So it's not actually during the usage of the app. Most probably the display features won't change more than once or twice during the runtime. So the user spans the app, you get an update through the media query, let's say pipeline, but then other stuff changes more than the display features. So they don't change that often. Okay, so I hope I addressed that. A lot of people telling me I'm doing great. Thank you, Chuckles and Paul as well. Quick question, unrelevant to your session. It's okay, we can discuss anything, but relevant to you since you work at Microsoft. What's your opinion on Microsoft MAUI and its impact on Flutter? So um, the um, the declarative version of Xamarin, for people that don't know exactly what the question is, um, I know it's being developed, and I know it looks kind of awesome. I like how it looks. I can't really talk too much about it because I'm not the person on my team to ask about it. I wish maybe I would have thought about this before and made sure that my colleague was also here somehow. He would have told you everything about it. But to address the second part of your question, what its impact will be on Flutter, I think every framework has a particular niche and space in the um, framework or cross-platform market. I've seen a lot of questions, on all kinds of Flutter communities. Is Flutter going to replace Android? Of course, it's not going to replace Android. Is it going to replace React Native? Probably not. There will be plenty of JavaScript developers that will still love React Native, and that's awesome, right? It's awesome that we can pick and choose what good framework to use, because all of these are really good frameworks. So yeah, the last question: can we listen to the hinge? How many degrees it has? Okay, so I think I answered that question. There's a separate library that you can use. It's on pub.dev, and it's called, I think, dual screen, just dual screen. If it's owned by Microsoft, you'll know you're using the right one. That's all I have. I think the last part with the Q&A should have been like with Valentina online, but I took the lead and answered the questions, so I hope you don't mind.
Oh, that's okay. You were doing great. Yeah. I think you skipped a question by Serge. Can user decide to limit an expanded application to remain on a single part of the display, for example, force the split view?
Okay. That's a very good question. Thank you, Serge. So the answer is you cannot, but it's up to the user to decide if they like using your application like that. So by default, it opens up on one screen. We're not forcing your application to do anything. It's the user's decision if they span it. They see it doesn't work as well as they hoped it would, and they can unspan it. That's usually what they do. It's a learning experience for them. So they will try it with an app. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and they go back to unspan it. So you don't need to worry about users mistakenly using it in spanned mode or your application being forced to do something it doesn't want to do in a way. So I hope that answers your question. Also, I think we're working, but this is kind of behind the scenes stuff. We're still working with Google on making this kind of support more accessible. So for example, I know there's efforts on our side to maybe have the option to open the application on both screens at the same time if you define it in the manifest in some way. Or so the answer is you can't do what you asked for right now, but maybe one day you can. These things are not set in stone, and we're still working on support with Google.
Okay, thank you. Well, I hope you will join us at the spatial chat at Q&A English room. And
Okay, and
yeah,
thank
and you
you.
guys can go there and continue the conversation. Okay, and thank you one more time for this amazing presentation. It was very wholesome and informative, and I loved the way you communicated with the audience and your jokes. I loved them many times. So thank you very much. You just put a whole new perspective to me, opened a whole new perspective for developing for foldable devices, and it's just way more interesting than I could have even imagined.